The knife I was scrubbing had killed me. I did not know this the way a child knows the sky is blue. I knew it the way my hands knew the weight of a laundry paddle before my mind had finished deciding to lift it, a certainty that lived beneath thought, in the bones, in the small hitch of breath that came before recognition arrived. Rain slid down my collar. The stone courtyard behind the wrong kitchens was slick and gray, and I knelt over a shallow basin with a rag wound around my knuckles, working at a blade that second Aunt Chui had thrust into my hands not an hour before. "Blood doesn't lift itself, Aju," she'd said, not unkindly, only tired, the way all the kitchen women were tired. "Steward Fang wants it clean before the silk inspector arrives. Don't ask me why a kitchen knife needs to look as if it's never cut anything." I hadn't asked. I only stared at the hilt, plain pear wood, banded in brass, gone dull with age, a single character scratched crookedly at the base where a careless hand had once tried to mark it as household property and given up halfway through. Wrong. I had scratched that character myself, 7 years ago in another body with a different name in my mouth and a full set of adult memories behind my eyes. I had taken a boning knife from this same kitchen to trim reeds for a birdcage, and I had carved that lazy, unfinished stroke because I was in a hurry to get back before my stepmother noticed I'd left my rooms unescorted. I was 8 years old now, and I had never held this knife before, and I knew with the same wordless certainty that told me rain was cold, that this was the knife that opened my throat in the dark of the mulberry grove 8 years ago, while Lady Wei Ru Xin stood 2 paces back with a silk handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Not from horror, I would come to understand, but so the blood wouldn't spot her sleeve. I finished scrubbing. I did not let my hands shake. That, more than anything, was the first lesson of my second life. Stillness costs nothing and reveals nothing, and in this household, the only currency that mattered was what you could keep hidden behind your face. I set the knife on the drying rack among a dozen others, indistinguishable now, and went back to the wash line, and nobody in the wrong household noticed that the laundry servant's daughter had just held the murder weapon in her own 2 hands and calmly finished her chore. My name in this life was Su Aju, a servant's name, the kind given to daughters born to washerwomen and grooms and kitchen matrons, names that were really just placeholders until a girl was old enough to be married off to some other household servant and produce more hands for more houses. My mother was Shu Popo, though everyone simply called her Popo, Auntie, because somewhere along the way her own name had been worn away by decades of scrubbing other people's linens, the way water eventually smooths the engraving off a coin. She had raised me in the servants' row behind the east wall of the wrong estate, in a room with 1 window and a dirt floor swept so many times it had gone hard and pale as bone. She was not my mother, not truly. I understood this the way I understood everything in this life, with the doubled vision of a woman who remembers being someone else, watching a child's small hands do a child's small work, feeling love arrive anyway, unbidden and complicating everything I had planned. Because I had planned, in the black months after I woke gasping in an infant's body, with a newborn's helpless lungs and an adult's unbearable clarity, to feel nothing for this house. I had planned to grow, to watch, to gather what I needed, and to burn the wrong household to its foundation stones without a single tear wasted on sentiment. And then Shu Popo had held me against her chest on a night that fever took me at 4 years old, singing an off-key lullaby about a fisherman's daughter, rocking me for 6 straight hours because she could not afford the physician and would not let me go. And something in the plan had cracked, quietly, without my permission. I let her keep believing I was hers. It was the one lie in this life I never once regretted. In my first life, I had been Rong Shu Ying, the only child of Lord Rong Ande's first wife, born into silk and salt money that had bought the family a gentry charter 3 generations back, when my great-grandfather first won the imperial silk monopoly rights for the province of Suyang. I had grown up believing myself safe, in the particular way that only the beloved and unsuspecting can be safe, which is to say, not safe at all. My mother had died birthing me. My father remarried when I was 6 to a widow of good family and better composure named Wei Ru Xin, who arrived at the wrong estate with a face like a temple carving and a 3-year-old daughter of her own, Shu A, clutched to her skirts. For 9 years I called her mother. For 9 years she called me daughter, in the sweet, carrying voice she used whenever there were witnesses, and something colder in the rooms where there were none. I did not discover the forged ledgers until I was 16. I found them by accident, the way people always find the thing that kills them. Looking for a missing hairpin in Steward Fang's records room, I instead found 3 years of falsified silk tax accounts, the Imperial Monopoly Charter's renewal seal forged in Lady Wei's own careful hand, and a private letter from the Cow family, our chief rivals in the silk trade, thanking the Lady of the Wrong House for her cooperation in diverting 2 Imperial Charter renewals to Cow coffers, in exchange for a sum large enough to make my stepmother on paper 3 times richer than my father knew. I did not understand what I know now, that discovering a secret is never the dangerous part. Being unable to hide you've discovered it, that is what kills you. I confronted no one. I was, in that life, a careful girl, raised to be careful, and I decided to wait, to gather more, and to bring it first to my father's own steward, Old Fang, whom I trusted the way children trust the furniture of their own homes, simply because it has always been there. Old Fang told Lady Wei by evening.
3 days later, my stepmother invited me to walk with her in the mulberry grove behind the west wall, to discuss, she said, my upcoming betrothal to the magistrate's son. Shi Wei came too, laughing, swinging a persimmon by its stem, delighted at some private joke I hadn't been let in on. I remember the smell of the mulberry leaves, sweet and green, and the particular gold color the light turns in that grove in late autumn. I remember Lady Wei's hand closing over mine, warm and dry, the way it always was, and I remember thinking, even as the knife came from beneath Shu Wei's sleeve, that surely this was some kind of mistake. Surely my own family would not. They buried me without rites. No incense, no scroll of my name for the ancestor shrine, no 49 days of mourning bells. A servant's shallow grave dug in a single night by 2 grooms paid in silver and silence, in the far corner of the mulberry grove, where the roots grow thick and the ground is never disturbed for planting. My father was told I had run away with a lover, shamed the family, and was not to be spoken of again. He believed it. He believed it for 8 years, and grieved a version of me that never existed, and never once thought to ask why his daughter's favorite jade hairpin turned up, some months later, tucked with great ceremony into his new stepdaughter's hair. A gift, Lady Wei said, from Shuing herself before she left us. She wanted dear little sister to have it. I was given no name to carry into whatever comes after death, and yet something of me did not go where the nameless are supposed to go. I woke instead in a newborn's body, in a servant's row, 8 months after my own murder, with every memory of my 16 years intact, and a certainty settling into my new infant bones like frost settling into soil. I would grow up in the shadow of the house that killed me, unseen, unnamed, and utterly patient until the day I was strong enough to make them remember exactly whose daughter they had buried. I was 8 years old in this second life, on the day the silk inspector's knife inspection brought me back into the same rooms where I had once been mistress. The Imperial Silk Inspector came to Su Yang once every 3 years, a formality demanded by the charter our family held, proof that the wrong house's looms, ledgers, and household conduct remained worthy of the Emperor's monopoly seal. It was, Second Anne Kui told the kitchen girls, with the particular relish of servants discussing their betters' anxieties, the single day of the year Lord Rong Anne D did not sleep the night before. It was also, I had learned in my first life and confirmed quietly in my second, the one day a year when the household's books were opened to eyes outside the family, and the one day a year Lady Wei Roxon and Steward Feng worked hardest in the weeks prior to make certain those books told a story that was not entirely true. I was not meant to be anywhere near the front hall on inspection day. Servants' daughters swept back courtyards and hauled water, and if they were being tested for future kitchen work, occasionally carried trays as far as the side corridor before an aunt relieved them of the tray and the responsibility both. But I had made myself useful in small, unremarkable ways over the past 2 years. Quick hands, a memory for where things were kept, and a habit of never once breaking a bowl or spilling a tray. And above all, a quietness that adults found restful rather than strange. Popo had begun to be asked more and more to lend her daughter for the finer work. So it was that on silk inspection day, I was the one sent with a tray of tea into the front receiving hall, because the senior maid had turned her ankle on the wet stone that morning, and there was no one else free. I had not stood in that hall since I died in it. No, that was a different room, the small study where father used to review accounts, but the hall shared its garden wall with the mulberry grove, and the light fell through the same lattice windows I remembered, gold and green, and for one unsteady breath, I was 16 again, carrying a different tray, on a different afternoon, before I knew what my family was. I did not let the tray shake. I set it down before the imperial inspector, a narrow, unhurried man named Lu Heng, whose robes were plain but whose seal ring was solid gold, the mark of a man who answered to the Ministry of Revenue and no one softer. And I poured the tea without spilling a drop, and I kept my eyes down like a good servant's daughter should, which is how I came to be standing 3 feet from Steward Feng when he handed Inspector Lu the ledger for the autumn silk tax, and how I came to notice, because I had spent 2 years training myself to notice everything in this house, the way a starving woman notices where every crumb of bread is kept, that the ledger's binding thread was new, fresh red silk thread, not even a season old, stitching pages that were meant to be 3 years old. My father sat across the hall on his formal chair, dressed in his best dark blue, sweating slightly despite the cool day, and I understood, watching him, that he did not know. He had never known. He was a weak man, my father, not a cruel one. He had simply built his whole life on the comfortable belief that his second wife managed things so he wouldn't have to, and it had never once occurred to him to ask what exactly she was managing them towards. Lady Wei sat beside him, composed as temple carving, her hands folded in her lap, a small serene smile on her mouth as Inspector Lu turned the pages of a ledger that had been rebound sometime in the last 2 months to hide whatever original pages had said. Beside her, Xu Wei, 14 now, lovely in the unfinished way of girls who have never had to earn anything, wore, as she always did on formal days, a jade hairpin carved in the shape of a magnolia bud. My jade hairpin. I recognized it, of course. I had recognized it for 2 years, since I was old enough to be trusted near the front rooms, and had first seen it glint in her hair while I swept the corridor outside her chambers. I recognized it the way you recognize your own name spoken by a stranger, with a small, total shock that you learn eventually to keep entirely off your face. I refilled Inspector Lu's cup without being asked. It gave me an extra 30 seconds in that hall, and I used them.
The wrong household's accounts are, as ever, a model for the province, Inspector Lu said at last, closing the ledger. My father's shoulders dropped half an inch in relief. Lady Wei's smile did not change at all, which told me, more than anything else could have, that she had known exactly what he would find, because she had made certain of it weeks in advance. But as I stepped back with the empty teapot, I caught, for less than a heartbeat, Steward Fang's eyes flicking to a 4th figure I had not properly noticed until then. A young man near the hall's side pillar, dressed plainly, standing with the loose, unbothered posture of someone who had learned young that no one expected much of him and had decided, long ago, to stop minding. Rong Yang He, my father's son by a concubine who had died before I was born in my first life,
my half-brother, 4 years my senior, who had grown up in this house as a kind of afterthought, tolerated but never quite claimed, given a small allowance and no real position and a courtesy title that meant nothing in practice. In my first life, I had barely spoken 30 words to him across 16 years. He had always seemed to me then like furniture that had opinions it never voiced. He was watching Steward Feng's face with an attention that had nothing sleepy about it at all. I filed that away too. In this life, I had learned to file everything away, patiently, without letting a single thing show on my face, because I understood something now that I had not understood at 16. It is not cruelty that kills you in a house like this. It is being unable to hide what you know one moment too soon. That night, after the inspector's retinue had gone and the front hall had been swept back into its ordinary quiet, I sat on the packed earth floor of our one-window room while Popo mended a torn hem by lamplight, and I asked her, in the careless voice of a child asking an idle question, "Popo, why does young Mistress Shuei wear that flower hairpin every formal day? Is it very precious?" Popo did not look up from her needle. "It was a gift from the young miss who used to live in this house before your time. Rong Shi Ying, her name was, the first wife's daughter." "What happened to her?" Popo's needle paused just slightly in a way that told me this was a question the servants' quarters had asked among themselves in low voices and never quite answered to anyone's satisfaction. "They say she ran off with a man beneath her station and brought shame on the house. But," she glanced toward the door, though there was no one there, the old habit of a woman who had spent 40 years being careful what she said inside walls that were not her own. "Old Groom Han, before he died, used to say he dug a hole for someone in the mulberry grove the same autumn Miss Shi Ying disappeared, and that the young mistress's dowry chest was never once packed, the way a girl's dowry chest is always packed when she runs off to marry. He said it drunk, mind you, more than once, and nobody believed a drunk old groom over the mistress of the house. But he never once changed the story, all the years after, drunk or sober. And a man's lies usually get grander with retelling. His never did." She resumed her sewing. I sat very still, an 8-year-old girl in a servant's room, listening to the last living person in this house speak plainly for the first time of my own murder. And I felt, beneath the careful stillness I had trained into every muscle of this second borrowed body, something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but a colder, more patient cousin of both, settling into place like the final stone in a wall. "That's a sad story," I said in a small child's voice, and went back to my mending and did not let a single tear fall, because tears, I had learned, were for people who had not yet decided what they were going to do about their sadness. I had decided long ago. I only needed now to grow tall enough, patient enough, and quiet enough to do it. And to make certain that the reckoning came, it came not as some drunk groom's forgotten rumor, but as a truth so complete, so publicly undeniable, that even a house built on forged ledgers and a dead girl's stolen hairpin would have nowhere left to hide its face. Old Groom Han had kept his silence and his story for 8 years, and it cost him nothing but a reputation for being a maudlin drunk. I intended to make my silence cost the wrong household everything. The lamp had guttered low by the time Popo tied off her last stitch, and I lay that night on my thin mat listening to the wind move through the mulberry grove beyond the east wall, and I made myself a promise in the dark. I would not rush this. Rushing was for people who had only one life to spend on a thing. I had already spent one. I could afford, this time, to be patient the way stone is patient, the way a slow-growing root eventually splits a foundation no one thought to reinforce. I was 8. I gave myself, that night, a plan with no fixed end date, only fixed conditions. I would learn everything this house did not want known. I would become indispensable in ways too small to notice and impossible to remove. And I would wait until the day I could not be dismissed as a drunk groom's rumor or a servant girl's fancy, but had to be answered as a truth standing in the open before witnesses whose good opinion the wrong house could not survive losing.
It took 2 more years to find my first real foothold, and it began, as the truest things in that house always did, with something small enough that no one thought to guard it. Old Dr. Tan kept his medicine hall on Weaving Lane, 3 streets from the Prosperity Bridge Market, in a building so narrow it seemed to have been squeezed into existence between its neighbors as an afterthought. He was not the Wrong family's personal physician. That honor and that considerable stipend belonged to Physician Wu, a smooth, soft-handed man who visited the estate in a sedan chair and always agreed with whatever diagnosis Lady Wei had already decided upon before he arrived. Dr. Tan was for the servants, when a servant's illness became too costly to ignore, and for the poorer households of Weaving Lane, and I had learned by listening at doorways the way all children in that house learned things, for anyone whose family could not afford to be told a comfortable lie about what ailed them. I was 10 years old when Popo's cough would not leave her through a wet spring, and I was the one who begged Second Aunt Chi to run to Weaving Lane with what few coppers we had, because the household physician cost more than a laundress earned in a season, and Physician Wu did not treat servants regardless. Dr. Tan was an old man by then, spare and stooped, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed very little for all that they'd grown clouded with age. He listened to Popo's chest through a bamboo tube, asked her 3 sharp questions, and mixed a paper of herbs himself instead of sending an apprentice to do it, which I understood even then to be a kind of respect he did not extend to every patient. "Tell your mother to drink this twice a day, and to stop taking in wash from the dye houses until the cough clears," he said, folding the paper closed with quick, precise motions. "The lye in their water is half what ails her lungs." I thanked him and turned to go, and then, because I was 10 years old and had spent 2 years training myself to notice everything and say nothing, I found myself asking instead, "Grandfather Tan, did you know the Wrong family's first young mistress, the one who disappeared years ago?" His hands stilled over the herb paper. It was a small stillness, the kind that would have meant nothing to anyone who had not spent a previous lifetime learning to read the exact weight of a person's silence. "Why does a washerwoman's daughter ask about Miss Xu Ying?" he said, not sharply but carefully, the voice of a man deciding how much a question is worth answering. "Second Aunt Chi talks about her sometimes. She says it's sad." Dr. Tan looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look adults rarely spend on children, as though genuinely weighing what sat behind my eyes. Then he said, slowly, "I examined that girl the week before she vanished. Her father sent for me himself, an unusual thing since the Wrong house kept its own physician even then. He said his daughter had complained of headaches and wished a second opinion, quietly, without troubling Physician Wu. What did you find?" "Nothing," he said. "She was perfectly healthy, strong pulse, clear eyes, no sign of the wasting illness Physician Wu had apparently already diagnosed to the lady of the house." He set the herb paper into my hands. "A week later I heard she'd run off with a lover and shamed the family. I have treated patients in this town for 40 years, child. I know the difference between a girl who is sick and a girl who is being made ready, on paper, to be having been sick, in case anyone later asked why she had died of an illness no one else had witnessed." His mouth thinned. I did not ask further questions. A physician in Weaving Lane who asks too many questions about a gentry household stops having a medicine hall to ask them from. I am not proud of that. I tell you only because you are a servant's daughter, and this is not a story that can hurt you, since no one important will ever ask you to repeat it. I have thought of that sentence many times since. No one important will ever ask you to repeat it, because it was, in a way, the truest description of the shield my second life had given me. A servant's daughter is beneath suspicion, beneath notice, beneath the dignity of being lied to carefully because no one imagines she is worth the trouble of a careful lie. I had spent 2 years learning to be exactly that unremarkable, and Dr. Tan had just handed me the second stone to the foundation I was building, a witness, still alive, who had personally examined the healthy girl the wrong house later claimed to have buried of illness, if she had in fact been buried at all, or simply run off in shame as the household insisted. I thanked him and paid what little we owed, and walked the 3 streets back to the estate, with Popo's herb paper held against my chest like something far more valuable than crushed root and dried leaf, turning the shape of a plan over my mind, like a jeweler turns a stone to catch the light from every angle before deciding how to cut it.
I did not go back to Dr. Tan again for nearly a year, not because I had learned nothing from him, but because I had learned exactly enough to know that a servant's daughter who visited a medicine hall too often to ask about a dead young mistress would eventually become memorable, and memorable was the one thing I could not afford to be. Instead, I turned my patience toward the house itself. I made myself useful to second Aunt Sui in the kitchens until she trusted me to carry trays as far as the receiving hall without supervision. I made myself useful to old Nanny Zhou, who oversaw the young mistress's chambers, by mending torn hems quickly and without complaint, until she began to send me, instead of the lazier senior maids, to fetch and carry in Su A's own rooms. I made myself, in short, into exactly the kind of quiet, competent, forgettable presence that a household stops seeing as a person and starts treating as furniture. And furniture, I had come to understand, is present for every conversation that matters and is asked about none of them afterward. It was in Su A's chambers, folding linens in the corner while she had her hair dressed for the mid-autumn viewing, that I first properly laid eyes on the man who would become, in his slow and ambiguous way, the second thread of my patient unweaving of that house. "Young Master Jing He asked after you again," Su A's maid said, working a comb through her hair, in the idle tone maids use when repeating gossip they think beneath real consequence. "At the West Gate this morning, asked whether the young mistress meant to attend the viewing this year." Su A made a small, dismissive sound in her throat, the sound of someone swatting an insect she did not consider the effort of actually killing. "Tell him I have no time for a concubine's son who spends his days playing at accounts with the steward instead of studying for the examinations like a proper young master." She examined her reflection in the bronze mirror, tilting her chin, and I watched, from my corner with a folded quilt in my hands, the jade magnolia hairpin catch the window light. Honestly, Mother should never have let Father keep him in the house at all. It only reminds people. "Reminds them of what, young mistress?" the maid asked, combing. "That Father's first wife's blood runs thinner in this house than it should, and that we only tolerate the concubine's leftovers because Father is too soft to send them properly away." I kept folding linens. I did not let my hands still, though something in me had gone very cold and very attentive at plays at accounts with the steward. I had noted 2 years before, in the receiving hall on inspection day, that Rong Jing He had watched Steward Feng's face with an attention that had nothing idle about it. Now I understood he had reason to be near the steward's accounts often enough for it to be common gossip among the maids, and a young master with no real position in the household, tolerated rather than claimed, watching the household's most carefully falsified records with unexplained interest, was either the most dangerous kind of enemy to my plans or the most valuable kind of ally, and I did not yet have enough thread to know which. I filed it away the way I filed everything, and kept folding linens, and said nothing because I was 10 years old, and servants' daughters who said anything at all in the young mistress's chambers were at best ignored and at worst remembered, and I had not yet decided which of those I could afford to be where Rong Jing He was concerned. I met him properly 3 months later in a manner that was not of my choosing, and taught me more sharply than any lesson I had given myself exactly how thin the ice still was beneath a servant's daughter's careful stillness. It happened at the West Gate, in the gray hour before dawn, when I had been sent to fetch water from the well nearest the stable yard because the near well had been drained for cleaning. I was carrying 2 full buckets on a shoulder pole, my arms trembling with the effort of a body still too young for the work, when I rounded the corner of the stable and nearly walked directly into a man leading a horse. I dropped 1 bucket. Water sprayed across the packed earth and across the hem of a very fine dark blue robe. This servant begs the young master's forgiveness, I began, already lowering myself to kneel in the mud the way I had trained myself to do instantly and without hesitation, because a servant's daughter who hesitated before kneeling to a young master's wet robe was a servant's daughter inviting a beating. "Don't," Rong Jinghe said, and there was something in his voice, not sharp, not commanding, almost tired, that made me look up before I had fully lowered myself. He was looking not at his ruined hem, but at the spilled bucket, and then at my hands, which I had, out of 2 years of habit, already begun assessing for what I could salvage, the second bucket still upright, the pole not cracked, nothing broken that would cost more than an apology to repair. "You're Popo's girl," he said, not a question. "Azu, young master," I said, keeping my eyes properly lowered. "You carry water for the stable yard at this hour every day?" "Only when the near well is being cleaned, young master." He was quiet a moment. I risked just once the smallest upward glance and found him studying me with an expression I did not in that moment have a name for, not the idle curiosity of a young master noting a servant, but something closer to the careful attention Dr. Tan had spent on me over his herb paper, as though he too were weighing what sat behind a child's lowered eyes, and finding, unexpectedly, that there was more there than the eyes let show. "You've a steadier hand than most children your age," he said finally. "You didn't spill the second bucket, and you didn't cry over the first." He reached down, which no young master in that house had ever done for a servant's child in my memory of either life, and picked up the fallen, empty bucket himself and set it upright beside the other. "Refill it at the near well. It should be clean again by now. Tell whoever sent you that the 4th young master delayed you, if anyone asks why you took so long." He led his horse on toward the gate without waiting for my thanks, and I knelt there a moment longer in the wet earth, 2 buckets and a shoulder pole in my hands, watching his back recede into the gray dawn light, and I understood, with the same wordless certainty that had told me a plain kitchen knife had once opened my throat, that I had just been handed a small kindness by a man the household considered beneath consequence, and that small kindnesses in that house were rarer and stranger than any ledger I had yet found, and infinitely harder to read. I did not know that morning whether Rong Jinghe would one day stand beside me at the reckoning I was building toward, or whether he would stand against me, or whether, as I would come to suspect more than once in the years that followed, watching him move through that house with his careful, unclaimed indifference, he was building some private reckoning of his own, for reasons that had nothing to do with a dead half-sister he had barely known, and a mother he had lost too young, and a father who had never once claimed him properly in front of witnesses. I only knew that I filed him away that morning, not as furniture, and not yet as an ally, but as the one uncertain thread in a tapestry I had otherwise mapped with great and patient care, and that uncertain threads, I had learned in my first life at the cost of everything, are exactly the ones that unravel a plan when you least expect them to. 3 more years passed in that careful, patient way, each one folding into the next like linens pressed flat under a stone. I turned 13, then 14. I learned to read properly, not from any tutor, for servants' daughters were not taught letters, but from Popo herself, who once, before her own family's fortunes collapsed 2 generations back, had been literate enough to keep simple accounts, and who taught me in secret, at night, by lamplight, believing she was giving her daughter a small, unearned gift, rather than restoring to me something I had already possessed in a life she knew nothing of. I learned the household's rhythms the way a physician learns a body, where every scar and old injury sat beneath the smooth skin of daily custom. I learned that Steward Feng met twice a year with a merchant from the Cow household, always at the Prosperity Bridge tea house, always on days when Lord Rong traveled to the provincial capital and could not possibly witness it. I learned that Lady Wei kept a locked chest in her own chambers that even Nanny Joe was forbidden to dust, and that the one time I glimpsed inside, sent to fetch a fallen hairpin from beneath her dressing table, granted 30 unsupervised seconds while she scolded a maid in the next room, I saw not jewelry, but scrolls, dozens of them, tied in red cord, stacked with the particular neatness of documents meant never to be found and therefore never to be disturbed. I learned, too, the thing that frightened me most in all my patient watching, that Xue, now 17, and betrothed to the son of a provincial magistrate, had begun in the last year to speak of her upcoming marriage with a particular brittle anxiety that did not match a girl marrying comfortably above her station for love or even ambition. I overheard her twice in low, urgent voices with her mother, using a word I had not expected to hear in that house at all: audit. The magistrate's family, it seemed, required, as part of the marriage negotiations, a formality meant to protect their son's future prospects, a full accounting of the wrong household's silk tax records for the past decade, to be reviewed not by the imperial inspector's cursory triennial glance, but by the magistrate's own clerks, thorough men with no loyalty to Su Yang's merchant families and every incentive to find fault with a match they had not fully wanted in the first place. I understood, hearing that word, audit, that the ice I had spent 6 patient years learning to walk upon was about to crack open on its own, with or without my hand on it, and that everything I had built toward, all the slow gathering of threads I had promised myself I would weave only when I was ready, might instead be forced into the light far sooner than I had planned, by an audit I had not called for and could not control. It was, I would come to understand in the months that followed, the first true fracture in the foundation Lady Wei had built her whole quiet reign upon, the first proof that something I had believed entirely in my enemy's control might in fact be already slipping loose of it. And it was on the night I overheard that word audit spoken in Lady Wei's chambers with a voice with real fear threaded through its careful composure for the first time in 6 years of my patient listening, that I understood my second life's long silent apprenticeship was drawing, whether I was ready or not, toward the end.
6 years is a long time to hold a single thought steady, and I had spent every one of them promising myself I would not move until I was certain. But certainty, I learned that autumn, is a luxury the powerful grant themselves and deny to everyone waiting beneath them. And Lady Wei's fear, once I had heard it plainly in her own voice, changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about how much time I had left to wait. The magistrate's clerks were to arrive with the new year 4 months hence to review a decade of silk tax records before finalizing Xu Wei's betrothal contract. 4 months is nothing against 6 patient years, but 4 months, I came to understand very quickly, was exactly enough time for a household that had once rebound a ledger's binding overnight for a single imperial inspector's cursory glance to do something far more thorough and far more permanent before 4 clerks with no loyalty to Su Yang arrived to read every page with care. I understood this because I overheard it, not through Shi Wei's chambers this time, but through the kitchen door left ajar on a cold night, when Steward Fang came to the back courtyard himself, an unheard-of thing for a man of his standing, to speak with 2 grooms I recognized as the same pair who, old groom Han had once said, drunk and unwavering, had dug a hole in the mulberry grove 8 years before. I was banking a kitchen fire when I heard his voice, low and urgent through the crack of the door. Not the whole grove, just the northeast corner, past the old well marker, quietly, before the frost sets hard. The mistress wants it cleared and replanted with new mulberry stock before spring. Nothing left that anyone could dig up and misread, understand me? Whatever's there, deal with it properly this time and burn what won't stay buried.
I did not move. I had trained myself over 6 years not to move when stillness mattered more than anything else in the world, and I understood, banking a fire that had already gone to embers, that Steward Fang had just given 2 grooms instructions to properly dispose of whatever remained of my own murdered body 8 years buried in a shallow servant's grave before 4 honest clerks arrived with an audit that had nothing to do with me at all and everything to do with saving it. I had 4 months, not to gather proof at my leisure, but to save the one piece of evidence that could never be forged, rebound, or explained away, the one thing in that entire estate that could prove beyond any lady's composed smile or any steward's rewritten ledger that a girl named Rong Shu Ying had not run off in shame but had been put in the ground by people who called themselves her family. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my mat beside Popo's steady breathing and turned the problem over from every angle a 14-year-old servant's daughter could turn it from, which was, I reminded myself sharply, precisely the angle I needed to keep turning it from, because a servant's daughter who suddenly displayed a grown woman's strategic mind was a servant's daughter who would be noticed, and noticed was the one thing I still could not afford to be, not yet, not before I had somewhere safe to stand when the notice came. I could not dig up my own grave myself. A girl caught digging in the mulberry grove at night would be beaten at best and questioned at worst, and questioned was worse than beaten by a margin too wide to risk. I could not go to the magistrate directly. A servant girl's unsupported word against a gentry household's composed denials would end me disappearing as quietly and permanently as old groom Han's drunken stories had been allowed to disappear, dismissed rather than silenced, only because no one had ever thought them dangerous enough to be worth silencing. I needed, I understood the gray hour before dawn, someone the household could not simply dismiss or bury, a witness whose word carried weight the ledgers themselves could not erase, and who had reason enough of his own to want the truth found before the grove was cleared. I thought of Dr. Tan, who had told a servant's daughter 4 years before that he had examined a perfectly healthy girl a week before her family claimed she had died wasting from illness, and who had said with real shame in his voice that he never asked further questions because a physician who asked too many questions of a gentry household stopped having a medicine hall to ask them from. And I thought with far less certainty and far more risk of Rong Jing-hei, who had watched Steward Fang's ledgers with an attention that was not idle 4 years running, and who had once picked an empty bucket out of the mud for a laundress's daughter with his own 2 hands for no reason I had ever been able to fully explain to myself. I decided that gray dawn that I would need them both, and that I had at most a handful of weeks before the ground froze hard enough for Steward Fang's groom's work impossible until spring, which was the only mercy the season had left to offer me. I went to Dr. Tan first, because his door at least I understood how to knock on. I chose a morning when Popo's cough had returned with the first hard frost, true this time, not a pretext, though I confess I let it serve 2 purposes at once, and I walked the 3 streets to Weaving Lane with what coppers we had and a question I had spent 4 years learning how to ask properly. Dr. Tan was older now, his hands more spotted, his stoop more pronounced, but his eyes had lost none of their sharpness when I set the coppers on his worn counter and said quietly, "Grandfather Tan, I need to ask you something that is not about my mother's cough." He looked at me for a long moment, the same weighing look he had given me 4 years before, except now, I thought, there was less surprise in it, as though some part of him had been waiting, without quite admitting it to himself, for a servant's daughter to come back one day with a question grown heavier than the one she'd first asked as a child. "You've grown careful in your questions," he said, "for a child who once asked me plainly why she wanted to know about a dead girl." "I'm not a child asking idly anymore," I said, and let that sit between us, and watched him understand it. "What do you need, Ah Ju?"
I need you to remember, before witnesses, exactly what you told me 4 years ago, that you examined Rong Shu Ying a week before her family said she died of a wasting illness, and that she was perfectly healthy. I need you to be willing to say it to a magistrate's clerk if it ever came to that. Not now, not loudly, just remembered and ready if the day comes that someone with proper standing asks. Dr. Tan was quiet for a long moment, his ink-stained fingers still on the counter between us. "You understand what you're asking," he said finally. "Not a story repeated over tea. Testimony. My name on a record against a chartered gentry household." "I understand," I said, "that you have carried this for 11 years already, telling yourself it was not your place to ask further, because a medicine hall in Weaving Lane cannot survive angering the Wrong family. I am not asking you to ask further questions, Grandfather Tan. I am asking you to answer, honestly, if the questions ever get asked by someone the Wrong family cannot simply dismiss." He studied me for a long moment more, and something in his old, clouded eyes shifted. Not quite decision, but the loosening of a weight he had perhaps wanted for 11 years, someone, brave or foolish enough, to ask him to finally set down. "I examined that girl myself," he said slowly, as though testing the words for the first time in over a decade, "and I found her in perfect health a week before her family buried a story about her wasting illness, instead of a body anyone could properly view. I will say that to any clerk who asks me plainly, child, and I will not flinch from it, though I confessed I would like to know, before that day comes, exactly what a washerwoman's daughter intends to do with an old physician's testimony." "Justice," I said simply. "For a girl, no one was permitted to properly mourn." He did not ask me how a laundress's daughter had come to care so deeply, or so precisely, about a young mistress dead a decade before her own birth. I think, looking back, that some part of him had already begun to suspect the shape of an answer he did not yet have words for, and had decided, in the manner of old men who have spent a lifetime learning what questions cost, that he would rather not ask it aloud until he had to. Rong Jing-her was harder to reach and infinitely more dangerous to be wrong about. I could not simply approach him, a servant's daughter who sought a private audience with a young master, however unclaimed his standing, would be noticed by exactly the people I most needed not to notice me. I had to wait instead for an opening that looked like accident rather than intention, and I found it 3 weeks into my narrowing window before the ground froze, at the well nearest the stable yard, in the same gray hour before dawn where he had first spoken to me 4 years before. He was leading his horse again. I had come to understand, over 4 years of careful watching, that he rode out alone most mornings before the household awoke, to some destination he never spoke of, and no one in the house cared enough to ask after. He stopped this time without me having spilled anything at all, simply because I was standing where he could see me clearly in the gray light, and something in my stillness must have told him I was waiting for him, rather than merely working. "You've grown," he said, which was an odd thing for a young master to say to a servant's daughter, and told me more than any other single moment in 4 years that he had been watching me as carefully as I had been watching him. "Young Master Jing-her," I said, and did not lower my eyes this time, which was its own small, deliberate risk. "May I ask you something that is not fit for other ears?" He was quiet a moment, studying me the way he had studied Steward's accounts 4 years before, with an attention that had nothing idle in it. "You may ask," he said finally. "Whether I answer depends on the question. You watch the steward's accounts more closely than a young master with no position in this house has any reason to. You have done it for years. I do not think you do it out of boredom." Something shifted in his face, not alarm exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has just realized he has been read more accurately than he intended to be. "That is a bold question for a laundress's daughter to ask a young master," he said carefully. "I am not asking out of boldness. I am asking because I believe we may want the same thing, and I do not have time left to be careful about finding out whether I am right." He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence I understood I had gambled everything I had built in 4 years of patient stillness on a single reading of a man's ambiguous attention, and that if I had read him wrong, if he went straight to his stepmother or the steward with the story of a servant's daughter asking dangerous questions at dawn, everything I had gathered, everything Dr. Tan had just agreed to remember, everything I had planned across 2 entire lifetimes would collapse before I had finished building it.
"My mother," Rong Jinghe said at last, very quietly, "was Lord Rong's concubine before Lady Wei ever entered this house. She died when I was 6. Of a fever the household physician was very slow to treat, in a year when my father had just begun courting his second wife and had, I have come to believe, very little patience left over for a concubine's illness that threatened to complicate a more advantageous match. I have spent 18 years in this house being tolerated rather than claimed, watching a stepmother who arrived the same season my mother died rise to command every ledger, every servant, every silence in these walls. And I have spent the last 4 years quietly confirming, page by page, exactly how deep those ledgers' lies run, because I intend, one day, to make certain my father understands precisely what he chose not to see, when he chose comfort over his own son's mother." He looked at me steadily. "I do not know what a laundress's daughter believes she has to gain from asking me this, but I do not think, watching your face just now, that you are asking out of idle curiosity either. There was a girl in this house once named Rong Shuing, your father's first wife's daughter. I do not believe she ran off in shame, young master. I believe she is buried in the northeast corner of the mulberry grove, and I believe Steward Fang has been ordered to have that ground cleared and replanted before the magistrate's clerks arrive with the new year, so that nothing remains for anyone to properly find." I watched the color leave his face by degrees, watched 4 years of careful, unclaimed patience crack open into something that looked for just a moment like grief 8 years too late to matter, and rage that had finally found a shape worth pointing somewhere. "How," he said, very quietly, "does a washerwoman's daughter know where a grave is dug, that even I have only ever heard whispered by a drunk old groom no one believed?" I did not answer that question. I have never, in this second life, answered that question fully to anyone, not even Popo, not even in the years that followed when the truth of it became impossible to entirely hide. But I looked at Rong Jinghe in the gray hour before dawn, and I said the only thing that was both true and safe enough to say aloud. "Because I have spent every year of my life in this house listening very carefully to things no one thought a servant's daughter was clever enough to understand, and I am telling you now because the ground freezes within weeks, and after that, whatever proof remains of what was done to her may be lost for good, and I do not think, young master, that you want that proof lost any more than I do." He was quiet for a long moment, his horse shifting patiently beside him in the cold. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Time," I said, "and a reason for the grooms to be delayed or watched until I can find a way to have that corner properly examined by someone the household cannot simply dismiss." "And after?" he asked. "If you're right, if there truly is a grave there, and my father's wife truly ordered a girl's own bones burned before an honest audit could find them, what is it you actually intend to do with that truth, Ah Zhu? Because I have watched this house long enough to know that a truth spoken too soon, without the standing to make it heard, gets buried just as easily as a body does." It was, I thought, watching the gray light strengthen slowly behind him, the first honest question anyone in that house had asked me in either of my 2 lives, and I understood, answering it, that I had just found the second thread of the tapestry I had spent 6 patient years weaving alone, and that, whatever came next, I would not be weaving it by myself any longer. I intend, I said quietly, to wait until I have exactly the standing you speak of, young master, and then I intend to make certain this house cannot look away from what it buried ever again. He studied me a moment longer, and then, for the first time in 4 years of careful, ambiguous distance, Rong Jing-hei inclined his head to me, not the small nod a young master spares a servant, but something closer to the acknowledgement one gives an equal one has only just properly recognized. "Then we had better not waste the weeks we have left," he said, and led his horse on toward the gate, and I stood alone in the gray dawn light with my heart beating very fast beneath a stillness I had spent 6 years learning to wear like a second skin, understanding that the reckoning I had promised myself in a dark room at 8 years old had just finally properly begun.
The weeks that followed were the strangest of my second life, not because so much happened, but because so much had to happen invisibly, beneath the same placid surface of laundry and swept courtyards and folded linens that had disguised 6 years of patient watching. I had learned to be furniture. Now I had to learn to be furniture that moved things. Dr. Tan's part was simple in principle, and dangerous in every particular. He could not simply walk to the mulberry grove and dig. An old physician trespassing on gentry land with a spade would be seized before he'd turned the first shovelful. What he could do, and did within a week of our conversation, was write a private letter to an old colleague of his student years, a coroner's clerk now attached to the provincial magistrate's own office, not the son who was to marry Xu A, but a cousin of that son's household, a man named Ji Baoshan, whose duty was to certify, in matters of inheritance and disputed death, whether remains matched the identity claimed for them. Dr. Tan wrote to him not of the wrong family directly, but of a general concern, phrased as an old physician's professional scruple, that he had once examined a young gentry lady shortly before her family reported her death by illness, found her in perfect health, and had been troubled by the discrepancy for over a decade without proper standing to raise it. Would his old colleague, in strictest confidence, advise him on the correct authority to approach should such a matter ever require formal examination? It was a slow thread, and a thin one, but it was a thread that ran at last outside the walls of the wrong estate entirely, into an office that answered to the Ministry of Justice rather than to any silk tax charter, and that could not be bought off with the same coin that had purchased Physician Wu's comfortable diagnoses for 18 years. Rong Jing-hei's part was more immediate and far more perilous. He could not stop the grooms outright, a young master with no formal authority over the estate's laborers, ordering them away from a task the steward himself had assigned, would only draw exactly the kind of attention neither of us could afford. Instead, he did something quieter, and, I would come to understand, far cleverer. He began, in the weeks before the frost, to take a sudden and highly visible interest in improving the mulberry stock across the entire grove, not merely the northeast corner, riding out to consult with an old orchard keeper in a neighboring village, returning with saplings and grafting cuttings, and a great deal of loud, tedious talk at the dinner table about proper soil rotation, and which corners of the grove had grown tired, and needed the most careful, gradual replanting rather than hurried clearing. It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of harmless, faintly ridiculous enthusiasm a bored, unclaimed young master might develop to fill his idle days,
and it had the effect, as he intended, of making it awkward and conspicuous for Steward Fang's 2 grooms to clear only the northeast corner in secret and in haste, when the 4th young master had begun asking, with tedious regularity, about the health and progress of every corner of the grove, and inserting himself, under the guise of enthusiasm, into conversations about which sections would be worked and when. It bought us time. It did not buy us enough time. I learned how little time we truly had on a night 12 days before the new year, when Popo woke me before dawn with her hand already over my mouth, her face pale in the dark. "There are men moving in the grove," she whispered, so quietly I had to read her lips as much as hear her. "Stay here, Aju. Whatever it is not servant's business." I did not stay. I waited until her breathing told me she had drifted back into the shallow, worried sleep of a mother who has done all she knows to do, and then I dressed in the dark and slipped out through the gap in the servants' row fence that I had known for 6 years led to the grove's outer edge without passing the stable yard's watchful dogs. The frost had not fully hardened the ground yet. I understood, seeing the lantern light moving low among the mulberry trunks, that Steward Fang had decided he could not wait any longer for Jinghei's tedious enthusiasm to run its course, and had sent the grooms tonight, ahead of whatever schedule he had originally planned, because the new year and the clerks were closer now than the frost, and a steward's fear of exposure will in all move faster than a young master's patience. I crouched at the grove's edge, in a stand of bare winter brush, and watched 2 men I recognized, the same 2 grooms old groom Han had spoken of, years dead now himself, replaced but not forgotten, working with spades in the northeast corner, exactly where I had always known, without ever once having been told in this life, that the ground lay different from the rest. I could not stop them. A 14-year-old servant girl who ran shouting into a nighttime work party would achieve nothing but her own swift and permanent silence. I could only watch, my heart hammering, as one groom's spade struck something that was not root or stone, and both men went suddenly, carefully still. "Steward said, whatever's there, burn what won't stay buried," the taller groom said, low, and I heard in his voice not malice, but the flat, unhappy resignation of a man doing a task he had been paid enough to do and paid too little to refuse. "Bones don't burn easy in the cold," the other said. "We'll need more oil than we brought." They argued, low and practical, about oil and time, and whether the steward would accept the work half finished before dawn forced them back, the kind of argument that undid me more than any villain's cruelty could have, because it was so entirely without malice. 2 tired men discussing the disposal of a body the way they might discuss the disposal of a dead animal, simply because no one above them had ever taught them to imagine that the bones beneath their spades had once carried a name, a favorite hairpin, a father who loved her clumsily, and a stepmother who smiled when she bled.
I made, crouched in that frozen brush, the single most dangerous decision of my second life. I stood, stepped from the brush into the lantern light, and said, in a voice I forced steady, though my whole body screamed at me to run, "Steward Fang did not send me to help you finish tonight. He sent me to tell you to stop. The household head has learned of a difficulty and wishes to see you both before you go further." It was a lie built entirely on the thin ice of a servant girl's unlikely authority, and it should not have worked. 2 grown men should have laughed a 14-year-old washerwoman's daughter out of that grove without a second thought. But I had spent 6 years learning exactly how a great house's hierarchy of fear worked, and I understood, gambling everything on it in that frozen dark, that men paid to do a master's dirty work in secret are never, ever certain who among the shadows above them might be watching, and that uncertainty, more than any authority I did not actually possess, was the only weapon I had. "Who are you?" the taller groom said, lantern raised, peering at my face,
And why would the steward send a child? Ask him yourself if you doubt me, and explain to him why you delayed when he learns you left this corner half-dug and unattended while you argued about oil. In the 1 week a household guest of some importance has taken an unusual interest in this grove's replanting. I let the words about a guest of some importance sit exactly as vague and exactly as frightening as they needed to be. I did not name Jingha, did not name anyone, only planted in 2 tired, underpaid men's minds the specific fear that someone above the steward's own authority might already be watching this corner of the grove more closely than they'd been told. The 2 grooms exchanged a long look in the lantern light, the look of men who are paid enough to do quiet, ugly work, but not paid enough to risk their own necks on a night when the shape of the danger had suddenly, confusingly changed. "We'll come back after the head confirms it," the shorter groom said finally, already lowering his stade. "Cover it for now. If the steward says otherwise, that's on him, not us." They covered the half-opened earth with loose soil and old leaves in haste, and left with their lanterns and their spades, and their evident relief at an excuse to abandon a task neither of them had wanted. And I stood alone in the freezing dark beside a grave I had once, in another life and another body, been laid into without name or right, and I did not cry, because I had promised myself long ago that tears were for people who had not yet decided what to do with their grief, and I had decided, that very night, exactly what I was going to do. I went to Rong Jinghe before dawn at the well and told him everything: the grooms, the half-opened ground, the lie I bought us with. His face in the gray light went through several expressions in quick succession: alarm, then something like fury on my behalf that startled me more than I expected it to, and finally a hard, focused calm that I recognized because I had spent 6 years cultivating exactly that same calm in myself. "They'll finish it the moment Fang confirms there's no household head suddenly taking an interest," he said. "We have perhaps 2 days before he sends them back, once he realizes I never asked any such thing. Then we have 2 days to get someone with proper standing there before they do," I said. It was Jingha in the end who solved the impossible half of the problem I could not have solved alone, not through cleverness, but through a connection I had not known he possessed. His mother, before she became Lord Rong's concubine, had been the daughter of a minor clerk in the very magistrate's office whose cousin, Dr. Tan, had already written to in careful, scrupulous confidence. It was a thin, half-forgotten family thread, the kind of connection that meant nothing in the ordinary business of a great house's face and standing, and everything now in the narrow window we had left. Within a single day, riding out under the pretext of his tedious orchard business, Jinghe met privately with clerk Ji Baoshan himself and laid before him not rumor, but a physician's written scrupule already on file, a groom's fresh account of half-opened earth in a specific corner of a specific grove, and a young master's own family connection vouching for the seriousness of the concern. Enough, together, for a cautious, ambitious young clerk, eager to distinguish himself, to decide that a quiet, official, entirely proper request to examine disputed grounds prior to finalizing an audited betrothal was well within his authority to make, and worth the risk of a gentry family's displeasure if it meant uncovering something the Ministry of Justice would reward him for finding. The request arrived at the Rong estate 2 days later, delivered with perfect, maddening formality by a clerk's runner in the magistrate's household colors, a notice that, in the interest of ensuring no irregularities complicated the upcoming Rong Shu marriage contract, Clerk Ji Baoshan of the Provincial Magistrate's Office requested permission to conduct a routine survey of the estate's grounds, gardens, and outbuildings prior to the New Year audit, a request so bureaucratically ordinary, so entirely within the bounds of proper procedure, that Lord Wrong, reading it in the front hall with visible relief that it concerned nothing more alarming than a garden survey, granted it without a second thought, and Lady Wei, standing beside him with her composed temple-carving smile, could not object without revealing exactly why an ordinary survey of the grounds should trouble her at all. I was in the corridor outside the front hall, carrying linens I did not need to carry, when I watched in the corner of my lowered eyes the first true crack open in my stepmother's composure in 6 years of patient watching. Not a scream, not a scene, nothing so crude, only the smallest whitening around her mouth, the faintest tightening of her folded hands, as she understood, half a second before her husband did, that a stranger with proper authority was about to walk into the one corner of that grove she had spent 8 years and considerable silver making certain no one properly looked at. She recovered instantly. She always recovered instantly.
I had come to understand, the whole of her power. But I had seen it, that half-second of true fear beneath the temple-carving stillness, and I understood, folding linens I did not need to fold, that the reckoning I had built patiently across 6 years and 2 lifetimes had finally, truly begun to move beyond my own quiet control, and that whatever clerk Jibao Shan's spades uncovered in that frozen ground within the week, nothing in the Wrong household would ever again sit quite as comfortably composed as it had that morning. They found what remained of me on a gray, bitterly cold morning 3 days before the New Year, under Clerk Jibao Shan's own careful supervision, with Dr. Tan present as an independent physician to certify what the bones could still tell, and, though neither Lord Wrong nor Lady Wei knew it yet, with Wrong Jinghe watching from the grove's edge, his face unreadable, and with a servant's daughter carrying a tea tray to the working men who needed warming against the cold, standing close enough to hear every word spoken over a grave that had for 8 years held the only physical proof of everything the Wrong household had built its comfortable silence upon. "Female remains," I heard Clerk Jibao Shan say quietly to his own recording clerk, "consistent in size and age with a young woman of perhaps 16 years. No obvious sign of the wasting illness one would expect to shorten a life, Dr. Tan. The bones show good health throughout." He paused, and I watched Dr. Tan crouch, his old hands careful and precise even now, and turn something at the base of the skull toward the gray morning light. "There," Dr. Tan said, very quietly, in the voice of a man who has finally been permitted after 11 long years to speak a truth he had carried alone for too long. "A clean, narrow mark here, along the throat's bones, not the mark illness leaves, the mark a blade leaves." I stood very still, holding a tea tray in the freezing morning air, listening to an old physician confirm before a magistrate's own clerk exactly how I had died, and I felt for the first time in 6 patient years something crack open in my chest that was not quite grief and not quite triumph, but the particular complicated ache of a woman finally hearing her own murder spoken aloud as a fact in the same cold air where she had once bled into frozen ground, without a single person present yet understanding that the servant girl pouring their tea had been the very girl whose bones they were examining. Clerk Jibao Shan straightened, his breath fobbing in the cold, and looked toward the estate's inner gates, where Lord Wrong Andy stood, summoned at last from the front hall, his face gone the color of old ash, as he looked upon a grave he had been told for 8 years did not exist, on land he had walked past 1,000 times, believing his daughter had simply run off in shame and never once thought to grieve properly. "My Lord Wrong," Clerk Jibao Shan said, with the careful, formal gravity of a man who understands he is about to say something that will reshape a household's entire fortune, I must ask you in the presence of this physician and for the official record whether you recognize these remains and whether you can explain why a grave matching a young woman's age and health, bearing a mark consistent with a bladed wound, was found unmarked and undisclosed on your family's land, on the very ground your stewardsmen attempted, not 4 nights past, to disturb and destroy before this survey could take place. I watched my father's face in that moment, really watched it, for the first time in either of my 2 lives, without the filial blindness of a daughter who had once loved him uncomplicatedly and never thought to question what he chose not to see. And I understood, watching him stagger back a step as though struck, that whatever came next in the reckoning I had spent 6 years patiently building, it would not be Lady Wee's composed temple-carving smile that broke first. It would be my father's heart, cracking open at last, over a grave he should have questioned 8 years and 1 entire winter of comfortable grief too late. And I understood, standing at the grove's edge with an empty tea tray in my frozen hands, that the household that had buried me without a name was about to learn in the cruelest possible way exactly whose bones they had spent 8 years pretending not to see.
The grave sat open under a sky the color of unglazed pottery, and for a long moment nobody in that frozen clearing moved at all. Not Clerk G. Baoshan with his brush poised over his record, not Dr. Tan crouched by the exposed bones, not the 2 grooms standing well back from a task they had been paid to finish and had instead, through my one desperate lie, left half undone and now fully witnessed. Only my father moved, and what he did was sink, without any grace at all, onto one knee in the frost, his fine dark robe pooling in mud, staring at a grave he had walked past 1,000 times in 8 years of believing his daughter had shamed him by running off with a lover. "Shi Yung," he said. And it was not a question, and it was not composed, and it was the first time in either of my 2 lives I had heard my father's voice break entirely past all the careful dignity a gentry lord was supposed to maintain before his own household servants and a magistrate's clerk both. That cannot be. "My lord," Clerk G. Baoshan said, with the careful patience of a man who has delivered ruin to gentry households before and knows precisely how much silence to allow before pressing further, "I understand this is a grave shock, but I must ask again, formally, for the record, do you recognize anything about these remains or this location that speaks to your daughter's disappearance 8 years past?" My father did not answer. He could not. I watched him instead reach with a trembling hand toward the grave's edge, and Dr. Tan, gently but with the immovable firmness of an old physician who has spent 11 years waiting to be permitted to do exactly this, caught his wrist before he could disturb what remained. "My lord," Dr. Tan said, "I examined your daughter myself a week before her disappearance, at your own request, in confidence, because you wished a second opinion beyond Physician Wu. I found her in perfect health. I have carried that knowledge for 11 years, unable to speak it without ruining myself and being disbelieved besides. I am permitted to speak it now before proper authority, and I will not soften it for anyone's comfort. This is not the grave of a girl who died of wasting illness, nor the grave of a girl who ran from this house in shame. This is the grave of a girl who was murdered and hidden and mourned falsely for 8 years by a family that never once asked why her dowry chest sat unpacked." I stood at the clearing's edge with my empty tea tray, close enough to hear every word, far enough to remain what I had trained myself for 6 years to be, invisible, unremarkable, furniture with ears. I watched my father's face crumple in a way I had never once seen it crumple in my first 16 years as his beloved, unsuspecting daughter, and I felt, standing there, the strangest and most complicated thing my second life had yet asked of me: pity, real and unwilled, for a weak man who had built his whole comfortable existence on not asking questions, now forced at last to see exactly what his comfort had cost him. It was not forgiveness. I want to be honest in the telling of this, that it was never forgiveness. But it was pity, and pity is its own kind of complication, and I filed it away with everything else, because I had not yet decided what to do with a father's grief, only with a stepmother's crime. Lady Wei arrived at the clearing perhaps 4 minutes after her husband, summoned by a maid who had run for her the moment Lord Wrong's collapse became impossible to hide from the household, and I watched, with the particular attention I had spent 6 years perfecting, exactly how she composed her face before she reached the grove's edge. Not the raw shock her husband wore, but something colder and far more practiced, grief assembled in careful layers over whatever she truly felt beneath it, the way a woman puts on court robes one piece at a time. "What is the meaning of this?" she said, and her voice carried, pitched exactly loud enough for the clerk and the grooms and the gathering knot of servants at the clearing's edge without being loud enough to seem unseemly. "Digging in my family's grove without proper notice. My lord, surely this is some manner of mistake, some vagrant's unmarked grave mistaken for—" "Lady Wrong," Clerk Ji Baoshan said, and I noted that he did not soften his address to her the way a lesser clerk might, out of deference to her standing. "I have here a physician's sworn account that he examined your late husband's first daughter in perfect health a week before her reported death by illness. I have here 2 of your own household's grooms who will attest, if pressed, that they were instructed to clear and disturb this specific corner of ground before this survey could take place, an instruction that, I confess, strikes me as a strange precaution for anyone to take regarding an unmarked vagrant's grave they had no reason to believe existed." He let that sit a moment, watching her face with the flat, patient attention of a man whose whole career depended on reading this kind of composure for its cracks. "Perhaps you can help me understand, Lady Wrong, why your household's steward would have ordered this ground cleared at all, unless he already knew precisely what lay beneath it." I watched Lady Wei's composed grief flicker for just a fraction of a second into something far colder and far more calculating, the look of a woman rapidly recalculating which lie remained to her available, and finding for the first time in 8 years that none of them quite fit anymore. Steward Feng manages the estate's grounds according to seasonal need. If he ordered this corner cleared, it was for replanting, nothing more. I cannot answer for every instruction he gives the grooms without my direct oversight. Then perhaps we should ask Steward Feng himself. They sent for him. He did not come, or rather, by the time a runner reached his quarters near the estate's front office, Steward Feng was already gone, his account books left open on his desk, a small traveling bag missing from beside his bed, and a horse absent from the stable that the head groom swore had been there the evening before.
I understood, standing at the clearing's edge with my cold tea tray, watching the news of Feng's flight ripple through the gathered household like frost cracking across still water, that a man who had spent decades quietly falsifying a great house's ledgers had just made the same calculation I had spent 6 years learning to make in reverse. That when a house's foundation begins to crack, the wisest thing a man built into that foundation can do is leave before the whole structure comes down upon him. Steward Feng had chosen flight over loyalty the moment loyalty stopped being profitable, and in doing so he had handed Lady Wei, without meaning to, the one thing she needed most in that terrible moment, a convenient, absent, already guilty-looking scapegoat. "There," she said, turning to her husband with something almost like relief breaking through her composed grief. "There is your answer, my lord. Steward Feng has fled rather than face questioning. Clearly, whatever was done here, whatever crime lies beneath this ground, was his doing alone, some private cruelty of his own that none of us ever suspected. I am as horrified as you are to learn our own steward harbored such wickedness beneath our roof."
It was, I understood immediately, a brilliant and monstrous piece of improvisation, built in real time atop a fleeing man's convenient absence, and it very nearly worked. I watched my father's grief-stricken face grasp at it the way a drowning man grasps at driftwood, watched relief begin to loosen the horror in his shoulders at the thought that his wife, his household, his own comfortable 8 years of believing a false and shameful story might not be truly at fault after all, that a single wicked steward, now conveniently vanished, might bear the whole weight of what had been done to his daughter. I could not let that happen. I had spent 6 years being furniture precisely so that I would still be standing, unnoticed, in exactly this moment, and I understood, watching my father's relief begin to calcify into a story that would let Lady Wei walk away from her own daughter's murder with nothing more than a servant's flight to answer for, that if I did not act now, in this exact frozen minute, the reckoning I had built 2 lifetimes toward would be buried again. This time not in mulberry soil, but in a grieving father's desperate need to believe the woman beside him was innocent. I set down my tea tray. "Forgive this servant," I said, and my voice, though I had never once in 6 years spoken above a servant's proper murmur in that household, carried clearly across the frozen clearing. "There is no official inquiry." Every head in that clearing turned toward me, my father's, wet-eyed and startled, Lady Wei's, gone suddenly, dangerously still, Clerk Ji Baoshan's sharpening with immediate professional interest, and from the edge of the gathering where he had stood silent and watchful throughout, Rong Jing-hei's, unreadable but intent. "Who?" Lady Wei said, and her voice, for the first time in 6 years of my careful listening, had lost every trace of her composed warmth. "Gave a laundress's daughter leave to speak in this gathering." "I did," Clerk Ji Baoshan said, before I could answer for myself, "the moment she claimed knowledge relevant to an official inquiry. Child, what do you know and how do you know it?" I stood very still in the frozen clearing, with my father's grieving eyes and my stepmother's suddenly murderous composure, and a magistrate's clerk's sharp professional attention all fixed upon me at once, and I understood that I had just spent every ounce of invisibility I had spent 6 patient years building, and that whatever I said next would either finish what I had begun or bury me alongside the bones we had just uncovered. "I know," I said, "that Steward Feng did not order this ground cleared on his own authority. I have carried water past the back study window on many nights, and heard, more than once, Lady Rong give him instructions in low voices that were not meant for servants' ears, instructions about ledgers, and silence, and what must never be found. I know that the jade hairpin the young mistress wears at every formal occasion once belonged to the girl buried in this ground, and that it was given to her, by the young mistress's own mother, a strange gift if the girl who wore it first had truly only run off in shame, and was not in truth already dead. I did not say the rest, did not say the words, 'I am that girl,' did not yet dare the full weight of that claim before I had gathered every last thread I needed to make it unassailable. But I watched, in the frozen silence that followed, exactly how much damage the pieces I had spoken aloud already caused. I watched my father's grieving eyes turn slowly, terribly towards his wife's throat, towards the composed stillness that had governed every silence in that house for 8 years, and I watched for the first time real fear break all the way through Lady Wei Ruxin's carefully assembled grief. "This is absurd," she said, too quickly, her voice climb half a register past its practiced calm. "A servant girl's fanciful gossip repeated for attention proves nothing." "Perhaps not on its own," Clerk Ji Baoshan said, and I heard in his careful, deliberate tone a man who had just been handed exactly the thread he needed to pull an entire tapestry apart.
but a physician's sworn testimony of health, a groom's account of instructions to disturb this ground before an audit, a servant's account of the hairpin's provenance, and a steward's convenient flight the very morning his crimes were about to be examined, these are not, together, nothing, Lady Wrong. I think we had best continue this inquiry somewhere more formal than a frozen grove, where every word can be properly recorded, and where I may ask you directly before witnesses whose standing you cannot dismiss, exactly what instructions you gave your steward regarding this ground, and why. I watched Lady Way's composed face for the second time that terrible morning come within a hair's breadth of true, unguarded fear, and I understood, standing in the frozen clearing, with an unbelievable joy burning inside the pale air.